Before we begin, subscribe if you believe the greatest love stories are born from impossible choices. Like this video, and share it with someone who still believes that fate can change everything. Now, let's begin. The strangest thing about fate is that it never knocks first. It simply walks in and changes everything. I used to believe weddings were the safest places in the world. People smiled. Families reunited. Promises were made beneath stained glass and fresh flowers. My job was simple. I arranged bouquets, straightened ribbons, and disappeared before anyone noticed the florist. That Saturday morning began exactly the same way. My old delivery van rattled across Maple Avenue with buckets of ivory roses sliding gently in the back, the smell of eucalyptus filling the cab, while my favorite local radio station faded in and out through worn speakers. I remember checking the dashboard clock. 8:23. 22 minutes before guests would start arriving. If I missed my schedule, I would lose the final payment, and my little flower shop couldn't afford another bad month. My landlord had already taped a polite reminder to my front window. The electric bill sat folded inside my apron pocket because I couldn't bear opening it again. Mom's pharmacy receipt rested beside it, reminding me that prescriptions didn't wait for better days. I parked beside St. Matthew's Church and carried the first arrangement inside, grateful for the cool air that drifted through the stone hallways. Volunteers hurried between pews, laughing nervously. Someone practiced the organ. Children chased each other until an exhausted grandmother finally caught them. Ordinary, warm, comforting. Exactly the kind of morning I needed. The bride, Olivia Mercer, peeked from the dressing room wearing a robe instead of her gown. She smiled when she saw the flowers. "They're perfect, Natalie." I smiled back. "They deserve someone brave enough to carry them." She laughed, but the sound faded almost immediately. Her eyes wandered toward the front entrance, as if she expected someone who hadn't arrived yet. "Everything okay?" I asked. She nodded too quickly. "Just wedding nerves." I'd seen enough brides to recognize the difference between excitement and worry, but it wasn't my place to ask questions. I returned to the altar and adjusted the center arrangement one final time. That's when I noticed it. One bouquet felt heavier than all the others. At first, I blamed the soaked floral foam hidden beneath the stems. Then curiosity won. I carefully loosened the satin ribbon wrapped around the handle. Something firm pressed against my fingertips. A tiny brass key, barely 2 inches long, neatly taped beneath the ribbon where no bride would ever notice it until long after the ceremony. My stomach tightened. Someone had hidden it there on purpose. I glanced toward the empty pews. No one was watching. I slipped the key into my apron pocket, planning to ask Olivia about it once the ceremony ended. Maybe it belonged to an heirloom box or an old family tradition. Strange things happened at weddings all the time. I told myself not to overthink it. Then the church doors opened again. A man stepped inside wearing an expensive charcoal suit, carrying no gift, offering no smile. He didn't walk toward the guests. He didn't greet the groom. He simply scanned the sanctuary with calm blue eyes until, for one impossible second, they met mine. Something in his expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. And without saying a single word, he reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and quietly whispered, "She's here." The words should not have meant anything to me. She is here. 4 ordinary syllables whispered into a phone before the stranger slipped it back into his pocket, as if he had merely checked the weather. Yet something cold settled in my stomach. His eyes never left me. I looked over my shoulder, convinced there had to be someone standing behind me. There was not. Only polished wooden pews, white ribbons, and morning sunlight spilling across the stone floor in strips of gold. When I looked back, he had already turned away and disappeared through the front doors. I stood perfectly still, my fingers wrapped around the tiny brass key inside my apron pocket until its edges pressed into my palm. Maybe I was imagining things. Weddings made everyone emotional. Lack of sleep made people paranoid. I had worked 14 days without a single day off, and my mind had become very good at creating problems that did not exist. I took a slow breath and returned to arranging the final centerpiece. The church slowly filled with familiar sounds again. Soft conversations drifted through the sanctuary. The organist practiced the opening hymn once more. Children complained about uncomfortable shoes while their parents reminded them to behave. It was ordinary life, exactly as it should have been. I watched Olivia walk down the aisle for rehearsal photographs, now wearing the dress she had chosen months ago. She looked beautiful, but not happy. Every few seconds her gaze drifted toward the entrance, almost as though she expected someone else to arrive before the ceremony could begin. Grant Mercer, the groom, greeted relatives with an effortless smile that photographers loved. He looked confident, polished, successful. The perfect man in every picture. Yet when Olivia reached his side, I noticed something strange. They did not touch. Not even for a second. There was almost 2 feet of space between them, carefully hidden by camera angles and flower arrangements. I had worked hundreds of weddings. Couples always found excuses to brush hands together before the ceremony. These two looked like strangers standing politely in line. Lucy Kent, my closest friend, hurried over carrying extra candles. She leaned close enough that only I could hear her. "You have that face again." I frowned. "What face?" "The one that says your instincts are bothering you." I forced a smile. "I am just tired." She laughed softly. "You are always tired." Before I could answer, the wedding coordinator clapped her hands, asking everyone to take their places. Guests continued arriving until nearly every pew was filled. Expensive perfume mixed with fresh roses and old wood. Cameras flashed. Laughter echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. I slipped quietly toward the back of the sanctuary where florists usually waited until the ceremony ended. My fingers brushed against the key again. I almost pulled it out to examine it one more time, but something stopped me. An older woman in the second row caught my attention. She had been smiling at the bride only moments earlier. Now she stared toward the entrance with unmistakable fear. Not curiosity. Not surprise. Fear. I followed her gaze. Outside the stained glass doors, several dark vehicles rolled silently into the parking lot one after another, moving with calm precision instead of urgency. Their polished exteriors reflected the morning sun like mirrors. Guests nearby noticed them too. Conversations faded one by one until only the organ remained. The first church bell began to ring. Olivia whispered her vows. Grant answered. Then, just as the minister prepared to pronounce them husband and wife, the heavy front doors opened once again. The sound that followed was not shouting. It was silence. The kind that settles over a room when every instinct tells people that whatever happens next will change their lives. I could hear the old church clock ticking somewhere behind me. I could hear my own breathing. Even the organ player slowly lifted trembling hands away from the keys. The tall man from earlier stepped through the doorway with measured confidence, followed by several men dressed in dark tailored suits who spread quietly through the sanctuary without disturbing a single flower arrangement. They did not rush. They did not threaten anyone. They simply stood near each exit with the calm discipline of people carrying out a carefully planned responsibility. The minister looked confused, lowering the wedding book in his hands. Olivia stopped breathing for a moment. Grant's smile disappeared so completely that it was as though it had never existed. The stranger walked down the center aisle, polished shoes clicking softly against the stone floor. No one dared interrupt him. Every guest seemed to sense that speaking would only make the moment heavier. He stopped halfway between the altar and the front pews, his blue eyes sweeping across the room with quiet precision before settling on me once again. There it was, that impossible feeling of recognition. I had never met this man, yet he looked at me as though he had spent years searching through crowds until this exact moment. My heartbeat became painfully loud inside my chest. Lucy glanced toward me with wide eyes. "Natalie," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "Why is he looking at you?" I wanted to answer. I could not. My mouth had gone completely dry. The stranger raised one hand. Not dramatically. Not with anger. Just enough for everyone to notice. His voice was calm, deep, and steady when he finally spoke. "Lock every door." Heavy metal bolts slid into place one after another throughout the church. The sound echoed across the sanctuary like distant thunder. A nervous murmur spread through the guests. Some turned toward the exits only to stop when they realized they were already secured. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer. The stranger waited until the room became quiet again. Then he looked directly at me. He did not glance toward the bride. He did not acknowledge the groom. He simply lifted one finger and pointed. Her. One word. Nothing more. Every head turned toward me so quickly that I felt the weight of dozens of eyes all at once. My knees suddenly felt weak. Me? I whispered before I could stop myself. He nodded once. Yes. My mind raced through every possibility. Had there been some terrible mistake with the flowers? Had someone confused me with another woman? Was this about the mysterious key hidden inside Olivia's bouquet? My fingers instinctively covered the apron pocket where I had placed it. The stranger noticed the movement immediately. His expression remained controlled, but something shifted in his eyes. Relief. Only for a heartbeat. Then it disappeared beneath the same unreadable calm. Grant suddenly stepped forward from the altar. "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to sound composed. The stranger never looked at him. "You should be asking a different question." Grant frowned. "Which question?" The stranger finally answered without taking his eyes off me. "Ask why the florist is carrying something that was never supposed to reach this church in the first place." For one long second, nobody moved. The accusation hung in the air like a note that refused to fade. Every pair of eyes settled on me, and I felt the same awful pressure I had felt as a little girl when a teacher asked a question, and everyone expected an answer I did not have. "I do not know what you were talking about," I managed to say, my voice quieter than I intended. It sounded small inside the enormous sanctuary. The stranger studied me carefully, almost as if he were deciding whether I believed my own words. "I think you do," he replied. "You simply do not know why yet." A nervous laugh escaped someone near the back of the church before disappearing just as quickly. The minister cleared his throat, attempting to recover some sense of order. "Sir, this is a wedding. If there has been a misunderstanding, perhaps we can discuss it outside." The stranger finally turned toward him with surprising politeness. "If we go outside now, someone in this room will disappear before the truth has a chance to speak." Those words settled over the guests far more heavily than any raised voice could have. Olivia looked from the stranger to Grant, confusion filling her eyes. "Grant," she whispered, "what is happening?" He forced a reassuring smile that never reached his eyes. "Nothing. Everything is under control." It was the first time that morning his confidence sounded rehearsed instead of natural. I watched his right hand tighten slightly around the edge of the altar until his knuckles lost their color. Lucy stepped beside me and lowered her voice. "Natalie, whatever is in your pocket, do not let anyone else take it unless you understand why." I nodded almost without thinking. My fingertips pressed against the outline of the tiny brass key through the fabric of my apron. It suddenly felt much heavier than a piece of metal should. The stranger noticed the movement again, but instead of stepping closer, he remained exactly where he was. That restraint confused me more than anything else. If he truly wanted the key, nothing appeared capable of stopping him. Yet he waited, as though the decision somehow belonged to me. "Tell me your name," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. A faint flicker crossed his expression. "Respect, perhaps. Caleb Vaughn." The name rippled quietly through the church. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. An older gentleman in the front row slowly removed his glasses, staring at Caleb as though he had recognized someone he had only heard about in whispers. Caleb ignored every reaction except mine. "Natalie Brooks," he continued, "did anyone hand you that bouquet personally yesterday?" The question caught me off guard. My thoughts raced backward to the flower shop. The deliveries, the invoices, the constant ringing of the telephone. Then I remembered. Just before closing, a courier I had never seen before had dropped off one final box with Olivia's name neatly printed on the label. He had been wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He had smiled politely, thanked me, and left before I thought to ask which florist company he worked for. I had opened the package, inspected the flowers, and added them to the wedding order without another thought. My pulse quickened. "There was a courier," I admitted slowly. I never saw his face clearly. Caleb nodded once, as though that answer confirmed something important. Then you were chosen, he said quietly. Not because of who you are, but because someone believed you would never question what was hidden among beautiful things. The room fell silent again, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized that whatever secret the little brass key protected had started long before I ever walked into St. Matthew's Church. The words echoed through my mind long after Caleb stopped speaking. Someone believed I would never question what was hidden among beautiful things. I looked down at my hands, still stained with traces of green from trimming flower stems before sunrise. I had spent years believing flowers carried only celebrations, apologies, anniversaries, and hope. Never secrets. Never whatever this tiny brass key represented. I slowly reached into my apron pocket. The sanctuary became so quiet that I could hear fabric brushing against my fingers. Every guest watched as I pulled the key into the light. It rested in my palm, dull with age, no larger than the key to an old diary. One side carried a tiny engraving I had not noticed before, a single wildflower enclosed inside a circle. My breath caught. I knew that symbol. I had seen it yesterday afternoon on the corner of the cardboard box delivered to my flower shop. At the time, I assumed it was the logo of some small supplier. Now I realized it had never appeared on any invoice. Caleb took one careful step forward, but stopped several feet away. Do not hand it to anyone, he said quietly. Not even to me. That answer surprised everyone, including me. If he had come all this way for the key, why refuse it now? Before I could ask, another voice interrupted. Natalie. Grant's tone sounded calm, almost comforting. He stepped away from the altar with measured confidence, smiling in the familiar way that had charmed every guest only minutes earlier. You have had a difficult morning. Let me hold it while we figure this out. His words sounded reasonable, safe, ordinary, yet something inside me resisted. I noticed Caleb watching Grant instead of me. His expression remained unreadable, but his shoulders had become noticeably tenser. Olivia looked from her new husband to me, confusion clouding her face. Grant, she said softly, how do you know what the key opens? The question landed harder than anyone expected. Grant blinked once. Just once. It was enough. He had never actually seen the key. I realized that too. He had guessed. A ripple of whispers spread through the church. Grant recovered almost instantly with an easy laugh. I was only trying to help, but the warmth in his voice felt thinner now. Caleb folded his hands in front of him. People reveal themselves when they believe they are still in control. Grant's smile disappeared. Across the sanctuary, I noticed the older woman from the second row quietly wiping tears from her eyes.
She was no longer looking at me.
She was staring at Grant with unmistakable disappointment. Lucy leaned closer until only I could hear her. Natalie, trust your instincts. They have never failed you when it mattered. I wanted to believe her, but my instincts had become a storm pulling me in opposite directions. Caleb had entered a wedding, locked every exit, and singled me out before an entire church. Everything about him should have frightened me. Yet he had never demanded the
key.
He had never even reached for it. Grant, the respected groom everyone admired, had asked for it almost immediately. My fingers closed around the old brass key once more. It felt warmer now, as though the metal had absorbed the heat of my hand. Then I noticed something else. Along the edge of the engraved wildflower, almost invisible beneath years of wear, were tiny letters no bigger than grains of rice. I lifted the key closer to the sunlight pouring through the stained glass window and slowly read the inscription aloud. Locker, 21. Harbor Station. The moment those words left my mouth, I realized more than one person inside St. Matthew's Church had already known exactly where that key belonged. The moment I finished reading the tiny inscription, the room changed again. It was subtle at first. A quick exchange of glances. A delayed breath. Someone near the back accidentally dropped a wedding program, and the sharp sound against the stone floor startled everyone more than it should have. Harbor Station. Locker 21. Those words meant something to people in this church, even if they meant nothing to me. I looked toward Caleb. He did not appear surprised. He looked almost relieved that the truth had finally stepped into the light on its own. "Natalie," he said calmly, "listen carefully. Whatever you do next has to be your decision. Nobody else's." That confused me more than anything. Every story I had ever heard about powerful men insisted they controlled every outcome. Yet Caleb stood several feet away, without taking another step. He was giving me a choice. Grant cleared his throat, forcing a smile that looked increasingly uncomfortable. "This has gone far enough. My guests are frightened. Give me the key, and we can settle whatever misunderstanding this is." I studied him for a long moment. Earlier that morning, he had looked like the perfect groom. Now I noticed details I had completely missed. A bead of sweat along his temple despite the cool air inside the church. His polished shoes shifting every few seconds as though standing still had become difficult. His eyes drifting toward the stained glass windows instead of meeting mine.
He
Was waiting for something.
or someone.
Olivia slowly stepped away from him. It was only a single step, but it felt enormous. "Grant," she asked softly, "have you been honest with me?" He reached toward her instinctively, but she took another step back before he could touch her hand. The silence between them said more than any argument could have. Lucy squeezed my arm gently. "You do not owe anyone an answer right now." She was right. For the first time since Caleb had entered the church, I stopped reacting and started thinking. Why hide an old key inside a bridal bouquet? Why deliver it through an ordinary florist? Why choose me, someone with no connection to this family? Unless that was exactly the point. I was ordinary, invisible. Nobody would ever suspect the florist. My thoughts returned to yesterday afternoon. The unfamiliar courier. The plain cardboard box. Then another memory surfaced, one I had ignored because I was rushing to finish deliveries. The shipping label had been crooked. I remembered straightening it before placing the flowers into the cooler. Beneath the label, another address had briefly peeked through before the paper settled back into place. Harbor Station. My heartbeat quickened. The package had not originally been addressed to the church at all. Someone had changed its destination. Caleb seemed to read the realization on my face. "Now you understand," he said quietly. "You were never supposed to become part of this. You were supposed to remain invisible until the package reached the wrong hands." Before I could answer, a ringtone shattered the silence. Every head turned toward Grant. He stared at the glowing screen in his pocket, without moving. The color slowly drained from his face. Olivia saw it too. "Are you going to answer?" she whispered. Grant looked at the phone, then at the tiny brass key resting in my hand, and finally toward the locked front doors. It was the first time all morning that he looked like a man who had completely run out of good options. Grant looked down at the vibrating phone as though answering it would seal a fate he had been trying to avoid all morning. The ringing stopped. A second later it started again. Louder this time, only because the entire church had fallen so completely silent that even the smallest sound carried through the sanctuary. He slowly reached into his pocket, but never unlocked the screen. His hand trembled just enough for me to notice. Caleb noticed too. "If you answer it," Caleb said in the same calm voice he had used from the moment he entered the church, "everyone here will know exactly who has been giving you instructions." Grant forced a laugh that convinced no one. "You seem very confident for a man who interrupted a wedding." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "Confidence comes from facts. Panic comes from running out of them." I expected anger. I expected threats. Instead, the two men stood several yards apart speaking almost quietly, and somehow that unsettled me even more. It felt less like an argument and more like the final moves of a chess game that had begun long before any of us walked into St. Matthew's Church. Olivia slowly removed her wedding ring before she had even finished wearing it. She stared at the small band resting in her palm with tears filling her eyes. "Please," she whispered without looking at anyone in particular, "just tell me what is real." Nobody answered immediately. That silence hurt more than any lie could have. I looked toward Caleb again, searching for the ruthless man people whispered about. Instead, I saw someone carrying exhaustion behind controlled eyes. He was not watching Grant anymore. He was watching every guest, every volunteer, Every child sitting beside frightened parents, making certain nobody was caught in the middle of something they did not understand. One of the elderly guests shifted nervously on the front pew. Before anyone else noticed, Caleb quietly gestured toward one of his associates. The man walked over, offered the elderly gentleman a bottle of water from a nearby table, and helped him sit more comfortably before stepping away again, without saying a word. It was such a small act that most people missed it. I did not. Neither did Lucy. She leaned close and whispered, "That is not what I expected." I nodded almost absent-mindedly. Neither had I. Every rumor I had ever heard painted Caleb Vaughn as a man who solved every problem through fear. Yet from the moment he arrived, he had spoken softly, waited patiently, and repeatedly left every important choice in someone else's hands. My hands. That realization made my chest tighten. Why me? I finally asked. Caleb met my eyes. Because you have nothing to gain by choosing a side that is built on lies. His answer lingered inside me. My flower shop was struggling. My mother's medical bills continued to grow. Every morning I worried about rent before I worried about breakfast. I was ordinary. Completely ordinary. Perhaps that was exactly why I had become dangerous to people who relied on everyone else looking the other way. The phone in Grant's hand finally stopped ringing. A notification appeared across the screen before fading. I could not read the message from where I stood, but I saw enough. Grant closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though accepting something he could no longer prevent. When he looked back at me, the practiced confidence was gone. "Natalie," he said quietly, "before anyone convinces you otherwise, there is something you deserve to see with your own eyes." Caleb did not interrupt him. Instead, he looked at me and gave a single slow nod, silently reminding me that whatever happened next would still be my decision. Grant slowly lifted his phone instead of handing it to me. His thumb hovered over the screen for a long second before he turned it around so everyone standing near the altar could see. "Read it," he said quietly. I stepped closer, still keeping the brass key in my hand. The latest message contained only one sentence. "Do not let the florist leave the church." No name.
No signature.
Just those 8 words. My stomach tightened. Whoever had sent it knew exactly who I was long before today. Olivia covered her mouth with both hands. "The florist," she whispered. "Why would anyone be watching Natalie?" Grant looked exhausted now, like a man who had spent months carrying a secret too heavy to hold any longer. "Because whoever arranged this never cared about the wedding," he admitted. The ceremony was only the perfect distraction. A murmur spread through the guests. People who had arrived expecting a celebration suddenly realized they had been invited into something much larger. I looked toward Caleb, expecting him to deny it or accuse Grant of another lie. Instead, he remained completely still. "Keep reading," Caleb said. Grant hesitated before opening an older message. This one had arrived yesterday afternoon. "Confirm that the bouquet reaches St. Matthew's untouched." My heartbeat quickened. Yesterday afternoon. That was almost the exact time the unfamiliar courier had delivered the flowers to my shop. "You knew?" I asked Grant. He lowered his eyes. I knew something was hidden inside the bouquet. I did not know what. Olivia stared at him as though she had never truly met the man standing beside her. "Then why marry me today?" she asked, her voice trembling. Grant swallowed hard. Because canceling the wedding would have warned the people behind this that their plan had failed. Tears rolled quietly down Olivia's cheeks, but she did not interrupt him again. Caleb finally spoke. "Tell her the rest." Grant nodded slowly. "I was told the florist would deliver the arrangement, leave quietly after the ceremony, and never realized she had been used. Someone else was supposed to collect the bouquet afterward." My fingers instinctively tightened around the brass key. "But I found it." "Yes," Grant answered. That changed everything. I felt as though the floor beneath me had shifted. Every choice I had made that morning had been ordinary. Straightening a ribbon, adjusting a bouquet, noticing that one arrangement felt heavier than the others. Small decisions. Yet somehow they had unraveled a plan that many people seemed to know about except me. Lucy squeezed my shoulder gently. "Sometimes the smallest choice changes the biggest story," she whispered. Caleb's gaze remained fixed on the key. Natalie, there is something you still do not know. I looked up. What? His answer came without hesitation. Locker 21 does not contain money. It does not contain jewelry. It contains proof. The word echoed through the sanctuary.
Proof.
Proof of what? Nobody answered immediately. Then the older woman from the second row slowly stood. Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse and removed a faded photograph. She looked directly at me before turning toward Caleb. If the truth is finally coming out, she said softly, then she deserves to know why her family was chosen long before she was ever born. The photograph looked ordinary until I took it from the older woman's trembling hands. Its edges were faded, and the colors had almost disappeared beneath the weight of time, but the faces were still clear enough to recognize the happiness frozen inside that single moment. A younger version of my mother stood beside another woman I had never seen before. Between them sat a wooden picnic table covered with wildflowers, and hanging from the woman's neck was a silver necklace with the exact same wildflower symbol engraved on the tiny brass key resting in my palm. My heart skipped. Who is she? I whispered. The older woman smiled sadly. Her name was Eleanor Vaughn. I slowly turned toward Caleb. His expression never changed, but I saw something softer behind his calm blue eyes.
Grief.
Quiet and carefully hidden. She was my mother, he said. The church became impossibly still again. I looked back at the photograph, then at Caleb, then at my own hands. None of it made sense. My mother never told me about her. The older woman nodded. She could not. They promised each other they would protect their families by pretending those years never happened. Lucy looked as confused as I felt. Protect them from what? The answer came from Caleb. From people who believed secrets could be bought, traded, or buried forever. I lowered my eyes to the photograph once more. There, almost hidden in the background, stood two young children chasing each other across the grass. One little girl carried a handful of white flowers. Beside her ran a young boy wearing a blue baseball cap. Their faces were too small to identify clearly, but something about the scene stirred a memory I could not quite reach. That was almost 30 years ago, the older woman continued. Long before businesses, long before power, long before everything fell apart. Olivia quietly stepped away from the altar and joined us. Her wedding dress brushed softly across the stone floor as she looked at the photograph over my shoulder. Natalie, she whispered, your mother never mentioned any of this? I slowly shook my head. My mother had spent the last 3 years fighting illness while I struggled to keep our little flower shop alive. Every week I balanced overdue invoices, medicine receipts, rent notices, and payroll, convincing myself that if I worked one more wedding, delivered one more arrangement, everything would somehow become manageable. My life had been measured in flower orders, grocery lists, and pharmacy visits. Harbor Station, mysterious couriers, hidden keys, and strangers in tailored suits belonged in somebody else's story, not mine. Yet here I stood with every ordinary certainty slipping away. Caleb watched me quietly before speaking again. Natalie, I understand why you do not trust me. He paused for a moment. But I did not come here because of what that locker contains. I came because once it is opened, the people who hid it will know the truth cannot be hidden anymore. I looked at the brass key, feeling its surprising weight against my fingertips. It no longer felt like an object. It felt like a responsibility. Grant slowly released a long breath. He is telling the truth about that. It was the first time he had openly agreed with Caleb. Before anyone could respond, the church doors echoed with 3 slow knocks from outside. Nobody had entered. Nobody had left. Yet someone on the other side clearly knew exactly where we all were, and for the first time that morning, I realized the next decision belonged entirely to me. The 3 slow knocks echoed through St. Matthew's Church with a patience that unsettled me more than panic ever could. Whoever stood outside was not demanding to come in. They were waiting because they believed someone inside would eventually make the decision for them. Every instinct told me to hand the brass key to somebody else and walk away. That had always been my way. Solve today's problems. Pay the electric bill before the late fee arrived. Deliver the flowers before the ceremony began. Pick up my mother's prescriptions before the pharmacy.
Closed.
Ordinary choices. Safe choices. But nothing about this morning was ordinary anymore. I slipped the faded photograph into my apron beside the key and lifted my chin. Open the doors, I said quietly. Half the room stared at me in disbelief. Caleb did not move. Are you certain? He asked. I met his eyes.
No.
But I am certain I am tired of everyone making decisions around me. A faint smile crossed his face for the first time that day. It disappeared almost immediately, replaced by the same calm expression. Then the choice is yours. He stepped aside.
No hesitación. No argument.
That single movement told me more about him than every rumor I had ever heard. Grant looked alarmed. Natalie, if those doors open now, everything changes. I looked back at him. Everything already changed the moment someone hid a key inside my flowers. Olivia slowly nodded, tears still shining in her eyes. She is right. Caleb gestured toward one of his associates, who quietly released the heavy iron bolts without rushing. The old lock slid back with a deep metallic sound that echoed beneath the stained glass ceiling. Sunlight spilled across the entrance as the doors slowly opened. Standing outside was not an army or a crowd. It was a single man wearing the gray jacket of a parcel delivery driver. He looked no older than 30. His shoulders relaxed the moment he saw me. Miss Brooks? He asked politely. I have been trying to find you since yesterday. Confused murmurs spread through the church again. The man held out a weathered envelope with my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. My mother's. My breath caught so sharply that Lucy reached for my arm. That cannot be possible, I whispered. I had helped my mother write greeting cards for years. I knew every curve of her handwriting. The courier glanced around nervously. A woman at Mercy Hills Medical Center asked me to deliver this if I could not reach you at the flower shop. She said it was important that nobody except Natalie Brooks opened it. My heart pounded. Mom had been in the hospital all week. She had never mentioned a letter. She had never mentioned Harbor Station. She had never mentioned Eleanor Vaughn. I carefully accepted the envelope. The paper felt worn, as though it had been carried for days. Caleb did not step closer. Grant did not speak. Every person inside the church simply watched as I slowly broke the seal. Inside rested a folded letter and a second object wrapped inside soft white cloth. My hands trembled as I unfolded the fabric. Resting inside was another brass key, almost identical to the one already in my hand, except this one carried a different inscription. Locker 22. Harbor Station. My fingers refused to move for several seconds. One brass key had already turned my ordinary life upside down. Now a second key rested in my palm beside the first, both carrying the same tiny wildflower symbol, both leading to neighboring lockers at Harbor Station. The folded letter shook slightly as I opened it. I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately, careful and steady despite the illness that had weakened her hands over the past few years. Natalie, the letter began, if you are reading this, then life has placed you at a crossroads I prayed you would never have to face. I did not hide the truth because I was ashamed. I hid it because I wanted you to grow up measuring people by kindness instead of fear. My eyes blurred for a moment. I swallowed hard and continued reading. Long before you were born, Eleanor Vaughn and I made a promise. If either family was ever threatened, the evidence would be divided into two places so that no single person could bury the truth forever. 2 keys. 2 lockers. 2 families. I slowly lowered the letter. Caleb had not moved. His expression remained calm, but I noticed the quiet sadness in his eyes deepen as Eleanor's name was spoken aloud again. Olivia stepped beside me without saying a word, offering nothing except silent support. Somehow that simple gesture steadied me more than any explanation could have. Read the rest, Caleb said softly. There was no command in his voice, only respect. I nodded and looked back at the page. If you ever meet Caleb Vaughn, remember one thing. Do not judge him by the stories told about his family. Judge him by the choices he makes when he has the power to choose differently. I stopped breathing for a heartbeat. My mother had written his name years before this day ever arrived. She had expected this meeting long before I knew he existed. Lucy looked from the letter to Caleb with quiet disbelief. She knew all along, she whispered. Caleb lowered his eyes for the first time that morning. Our mothers hoped we would never need to know each other under these circumstances. Grant slowly sat on the front pew, the weight of everything finally catching up with him. Then the lockers. He murmured. Caleb nodded once. Neither locker matters by itself. They only make sense together. I looked down at the two brass keys resting side by side in my hand. Locker 21. Locker 22. Suddenly I understood why no one had tried to force them away from me. One key without the other could never reveal the complete story. The older woman carefully folded her hands together. Your mother believed that only someone outside every struggle could decide what should happen next, she said. She believed that person would be you. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echo inside my ears.
Me.
A florist worried about overdue rent, utility bills, and making it to the pharmacy before closing time. Nothing about me felt extraordinary. Yet perhaps that was exactly why my mother had trusted me. Not because I was powerful, but because I still believed ordinary people deserved the truth. Caleb finally stepped forward one slow pace, stopping at a respectful distance. Natalie, he said quietly, I can protect the journey to Harbor Station. I cannot make the decision that comes after. That decision has always belonged to you. I looked at the two worn brass keys resting against my palm, then at my mother's letter, and for the first time that day, I realized the greatest test ahead was not whether I could uncover the truth, but whether I would have the courage to reveal it once I found it. I looked around St. Matthew's Church one more time, trying to remember how this morning had begun with fresh flowers, quiet music, and simple promises. Nothing looked the same anymore. The sunlight still poured through the stained glass. Windows, painting ribbons of blue and gold across the wooden pews, yet the room felt transformed because I had changed inside it. I carefully folded my mother's letter and placed it beside the two brass keys inside my apron pocket. For years I had believed my greatest responsibility was keeping my little flower shop alive, paying employees on time, finding enough money for Mom's treatments, stretching every dollar until the next wedding season. Those worries had not disappeared. They still waited for me beyond these church walls. But now another responsibility had quietly settled beside them. The truth. Caleb watched me, without interrupting my thoughts. There was no pressure in his expression, only patience. I finally understood why my mother had written those words. Judge him by the choices he makes when he has the power to choose differently. He had arrived with every advantage. The people with him listened to every instruction without hesitation. If he had wanted the keys, he could have demanded them the moment he entered the church. Instead, he had left every important decision in my hands, even when that choice carried enormous risk for him. I walked toward him until only a few feet separated us. If I decide to open those lockers, I asked quietly, what happens to you? A faint breeze drifted through the open church doors, carrying the scent of summer grass into the sanctuary before Caleb answered. Some people will not like what becomes public. He paused briefly. I accepted that before I came here. You could lose everything. He held my gaze without looking away. Some things should cost us something. The simplicity of that answer settled deeply inside me. Power usually demanded payment from other people. Responsibility demanded payment from yourself. For the first time, I saw the difference. Grant slowly stood from the front pew. The confidence that had defined him all morning had disappeared completely. Natalie, he said sincerely, I cannot change the choices I already made. But I can tell you one thing with certainty. If those lockers remain closed, people who trusted silence will continue believing silence always wins. Olivia looked at him for a long moment before quietly removing the bouquet ribbon still wrapped around her wrist. She placed it beside the wedding ring resting on the altar and took a slow breath. Then this ceremony cannot continue today, she said softly. No one argued. Even the minister simply lowered his head in understanding. Lucy smiled sadly at me. You came here to deliver flowers. I nodded. Now you are carrying something much heavier. I slipped both brass keys into my pocket and closed my hand over them. They no longer felt like mysterious objects hidden inside beautiful arrangements. They felt like promises passed from one generation to the next. Caleb stepped aside, clearing the center aisle completely. The road to Harbor Station is yours to choose, he said. I will walk beside you only if you ask. I looked from the open church doors to the people waiting quietly behind me. My answer surprised even me. Then do not walk in front of me, I said. Do not walk behind me either. Walk beside me, and whatever truth waits inside those lockers, we will face it together. The afternoon sun hung low over Harbor Station by the time Caleb and I stepped onto the weathered platform together. Behind us, St. Matthew's Church had quietly returned to silence. Olivia had chosen to postpone her wedding until truth stood where uncertainty had once lived. Grant had agreed to cooperate instead of hiding behind another carefully rehearsed smile. Lucy insisted on driving my old delivery van back to the flower shop, so I would not lose another day's work. Life had not stopped. My rent would still be due on Monday. My mother's prescriptions would still need to be picked up before the pharmacy closed. The carnations waiting inside my cooler would still have to be delivered tomorrow morning. Somehow those ordinary responsibilities made this extraordinary day feel even more real. Caleb walked beside me exactly as he had promised. Not in front, not behind. The station itself looked forgotten by time. Old brick walls carried faded signs from decades ago, and the waiting rooms smelled faintly of dust, coffee, and worn wood. Locker 21 stood beside Locker 22 beneath a row of cracked windows where late afternoon light stretched across the floor. I held one brass key. Caleb quietly placed the second into my hand. Both belong to you now, he said. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the first door. Inside rested a small metal box. The second locker held another identical box. I placed them side by side on a wooden bench before opening them together. Neither contained money. Neither contained jewelry. Instead, they held handwritten journals, family letters, photographs, business records, and a sealed envelope addressed simply to whoever chooses truth over fear. I carefully opened the final envelope. The paper inside carried 2 signatures at the bottom. Eleanor Vaughn, Sarah Brooks. If you are reading this, the letter began. Then our greatest hope survived longer than our greatest fear. These pages were never meant to destroy families. They were meant to free them from secrets that kept honest people apart. Tears blurred the words. My mother had never wanted revenge. Neither had Eleanor. They had spent years protecting their children from bitterness, while preserving enough truth that one day the next generation could choose something different. I slowly closed the journals and looked at Caleb. Neither of us spoke for several moments. We did not need to. Some moments deserve silence more than conversation. Finally, I smiled through tears that no longer came from confusion. All this time, I whispered, I thought someone chose me because I was invisible. Caleb gently shook his head.
No, Natalie.
They chose you because they believed you would see people before power. I laughed softly, remembering the worn Florist apron still tied around my waist. I had arrived at a wedding carrying roses. I was leaving Harbor Station, carrying something much heavier, yet somehow my heart felt lighter than it had in years. As we stepped back into the fading sunlight, I slipped my mother's letter into my pocket beside the old flower shears she had given me when I opened my tiny shop. 2 ordinary objects. 2 extraordinary reminders. One had taught me how to help flowers bloom. The other had taught me that truth, like hope, sometimes waited quietly for years before finding the courage to grow. And as Caleb walked beside me toward whatever tomorrow would bring, I finally understood that the strongest promises were never spoken at an altar. They were lived one choice at a time. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more unforgettable Mafia love stories. Leave a like, share this journey with someone you care about, and tell us in the comments, what would you have chosen if you were Natalie? Your answer might inspire someone else.
See you in the next story.